In the autumn of 2020, Bernhard, Lili and I launched the Common Sense Framework with the intention that it would support people in their endeavour to grow and maintain organisations where both the people and the organisation can thrive. In this video, I'd like to share with you the backstory on why we created the framework, introduce you to the 10 principles it's comprised of, and finally explain briefly how you can use it. In the early days, we categorized S3 as a framework. What we meant by that was well summarized in the now unfortunately defunct Business Dictionary as a broad overview, outline, or skeleton of interlinked items which supports a particular approach to a specific objective and serves as a guide that can be modified as required by adding or deleting items. While this definition provides a quite accurate description of S3, we found that people, especially those working in tech, often associated the word framework with large-scale, agile transformations they'd experienced and sometimes endured with more or less success. They mistakenly assumed that S3 was just another whole system approach to organizational change, an A to Z operating system that you're meant to install in entirety into your organization with the false promise that it will make everything miraculously better. Understandably, this conclusion led to some unnecessary resistance and doubt. So, in 2017, we dropped the term framework and replaced it with practical guide instead, to emphasize the flexible and open approach that S3 provides. But then, as time passed and people got more deeply into S3, we regularly received feedback that S3 is so much more than just a practical guide. People were discovering how it provided not only a menu of individual patterns, but also a coherent ecosystem of options that could be synergized in a myriad of different ways. More and more people were also recognizing how interacting with S3 patterns facilitated a development in mindset and provided ways to draw on the collective intelligence distributed among communities of people who come together to work intentionally toward a common goal. So, we wanted to find a descriptive headline that reflected those aspects as well. And this is how we ended up with social technology. So you might be asking yourself, how come we now have a framework again? The whole idea of the Common Sense Framework came about as an endeavor to provide a more comprehensive answer to a common question we hear. How and where do I start with S3? Our usual answer has always been, and remains actually, start by clarifying important drivers in your organization, prioritize them, and consider pulling in S3 patterns if and when your current approach fails to bring about the results you expect or wish to see. Although this answer makes sense and people generally appreciate it, we still often receive feedback that having more than 70 patterns to choose from can be a bit overwhelming. People want to know in which cases to bring in which patterns and if there are certain key patterns that are frequently used and that are useful in most cases most of the time. While we do have a pretty good idea of what some of these key patterns are, nonetheless, we wanted to avoid making general recommendations of certain patterns over others. Every context is unique and different patterns are more or less useful in each case. By emphasizing particular patterns from a position of reputation and authority, people could easily misunderstand this as some kind of off-the-shelf recipe, rather than investing the effort required to understand each specific challenge or opportunity they're facing, and to learn about the various patterns in S3 so they can make informed choices based on their own understanding of what might be useful and why. Still open to the possibility that our initial inquiry would anyway lead to a framework of key patterns, in early 2020, we set out to discover what a useful framework could look like. Besides wishing to provide a way to support people in figuring out where to start with S3, we also wanted to help them to zoom out of their specific situation and see the bigger picture. We wanted to support people in being able to more effectively identify areas of need and prioritize them, to know where to start making changes in their organization. And finally, we wanted this framework to stand alone, meaning that people don't have to know about S3 to get value out of the Common Sense Framework. After all, there's many options out there in the world that support people to improve collaboration, besides the patterns that we've documented in S3. Our exploration resulted in identifying 10 interdependent dimensions of any organization that require handling effectively if an organization is to not only survive, but also thrive across time. This in turn led to us defining 10 actionable principles that now form the basis of the framework today. So, why common sense? There's many ways to interpret common sense. Everything from being sensible to groupthink, being polite, or even being sane. So it's probably helpful to clarify why we chose this term. We understand common sense to be that conventional wisdom and those self-evident truths that require little proof to accept because of their coherence with the world that we perceive. Like Duncan Watts said, we can agree that something is common sense as long as we share the same set of assumptions. Through our work describing, explaining, and helping people apply S3 patterns to solve problems and respond to opportunities in teams and organizations over the years, we've observed an underlying common sense emerge. When made explicit, it can be considered by people for guidance towards developing and maintaining successful organizations. It's our opinion that the more people become aware of this common sense, the more they can consciously and intentionally shape their decisions and actions around it, to develop ways of working together that help both them and their organization to thrive. In our experience over the years, many people on this learning journey with S3 at some point or other exclaim, all of this is kind of common sense. Typically, someone else will jump in and say, yeah, but common sense isn't so common, right? And people laugh. It doesn't really matter whether or not you believe there is such a thing as common sense ways of working together in organizations. We do hope, though, that positing the idea triggers insightful conversations and that these in turn facilitate a more conscious inquiry into the assumptions that lie behind how we work together to achieve our common goals. If there was an end goal for the common sense framework, it's to support people to build organizations where both the people and the organization can thrive. During our inquiry to develop the framework, we identified 5 characteristics that we believe are essential for an organization to possess in order to achieve this. Firstly, they should be focused on value, meaning that people's efforts are directed toward creating value for the organization, its members, customers, and other stakeholders. It should be productive, meaning the organization is efficient in identifying, developing, and delivering the products and services necessary to achieve its purpose. It needs to be adaptive, meaning people are able to effectively identify and respond to organizational needs and changing contexts, both in the short and long term. It needs to be resilient, meaning the organization and its members are able to withstand adversity and uncertainty if needed. And last but not least, reciprocal. I mean that the organization and its members share a relationship of mutual reciprocity, where the organization is committed to the development, well-being, and success of its members, and vice versa. The Common Sense Framework is composed of 10 principles, each of which is intended to provide guidance on how to go about developing and maintaining these 5 characteristics I just mentioned over time. So, let's turn our attention now to the 10 principles of the Common Sense Framework. I'd like to begin by explaining the rationale for why they're illustrated in this way. The principles are divided into 4 categories, each category taking one layer of the circle: orientation, navigation, structure, and transformation. At the center, we have orientation, which includes clarifying purpose and developing strategy. Purpose, of course, is directly related to the concept of driver in S3 and points toward why we're doing what we're doing together. We use the term purpose rather than driver in the framework simply because we wanted to present the Common Sense Framework in a generic language that isn't dependent on understanding the concepts and terms from S3. Strategy relates to how we go about responding to that driver. We put these 2 principles, purpose and strategy, together in the center because they're at the heart of what we do. We've placed the 3 principles for transformation, that's develop culture, invest in learning, and build shared mental models, at the periphery because we view these as essential components of a container that embraces and enables the whole system to do what it needs to do. Between the center and the outer layer, we have the principles for navigation and structure, pointing towards essential drivers that every organization needs to respond to achieve the outcomes it requires. You'll find some details about these 10 principles linked below this video. So, having met the 10 principles, the next question, of course, is where to start. Each of these principles supports a specific outcome. To determine where to begin in your organization or team, take a look at the outcomes for each principle. That's the text after "so that," and reflect on where your greatest areas of need lie in the moment. Be aware too, however, that many of the principles are interrelated. Considering this might reveal that just because you have a challenge relating directly to one of these principles, making an intervention elsewhere might prove to be a more effective place to start. In any case, do check first that you're clear enough on your organization's or team's purpose and strategy before you proceed. It's going to be really hard to identify what changes are necessary or worthwhile if the big why for your organization and an approximate approach for responding to that why are both unclear. If you're interested in considering S3 patterns for responding to some of the areas of need that you identify, you'll find that for each principle, we've included a list of S3 patterns that you can consider and, if useful, try out. For now, we've named the patterns we consider to be most essential in relation to each principle. You'll find that link below as well. If you're already familiar with S3, you might well be asking yourself how these 10 principles correlate with the 7 principles of S3. Well, first of all, we chose to call them principles because that's what they are, a basic idea or rule that guides behavior or explains or controls how something happens or works. Remember, the common sense framework and S3 complement each other, but they're also designed to stand alone. The 10 principles of the common sense framework are 10 principles for individuals, teams, and organizations to grow organizations where both the people and the organization can thrive. Whereas the 7 principles of S3 are 7 foundational principles which enable sociocratic and agile collaboration and which underpin all of the patterns in S3. If you'd like to get started with the Common Sense Framework, you can do it right now, either alone, with some colleagues, or if you're helping others to improve their organizations, then with your customers and clients maybe. Here's an exercise that you can try. Think of an organization or a team you're part of or working with at the moment. And in relation to each principle of the Common Sense Framework, ask yourself, where are you strong and where are you challenged? What areas of need do you see in your organization? And considering the interrelationships between these different principles in the Common Sense Framework, where do you think would be a worthwhile place to start? Thanks for your time, folks. That's all for this lesson. Hi, and thanks for watching. My name is James Priest, and I'm a co-developer of Sociocracy 3.0. This video is one of more than 40 lessons from our Sociocracy 3.0 Foundations course. If you found it useful, please like the video and subscribe. And if you're interested to learn more about Sociocracy 3.0, check out the S3 Academy website. You'll find links in the description below.